This is an outrage. I will not stand for this injustice.
The courtroom in Boston, Massachusetts was quiet. Too quiet. David Miller's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. His palms were slick with sweat. He gripped the wooden tables so hard his knuckles turned white. Across from him, his cousin Mark leaned back in the chair, his lips stretched into a smug grin, his gold watch flashing under the fluorescent lights. David's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. He could hear his own heart pounding. Thump, thump, thump. The judge cleared his throat. "We'll now review the property documents." David's throat went dry. Mark slid a thick folder forward. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a predator. Clack! The folder opened. Inside were deeds, contracts, signatures. His father's name, his late mother's handwriting, even his own. David's stomach dropped. His vision blurred. Rage boiled in his chest. No, this can't be real. Mark leaned forward, voice low, but cutting. "You'll never see a dime, cousin. It's all mine now." David's fists trembled. His nails dug into his palms until tiny spots of blood surfaced. His teeth ground together. A sharp breath hissed through his clenched teeth. The judge's gavel echoed through the chamber, but David didn't hear it. All he heard was his father's voice in his head. "Don't let him take it, son. Don't let him win." David's lips parted. His voice was low. "They think it's over, but they don't know me. Not yet." David Miller grew up in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. His father, Robert Miller, was the kind of man who believed in hard work and loyalty. Robert owned a small construction company. He built it brick by brick, deal by deal, until it became a strong family business. David's mother, Linda, was softer. She worked part-time at a library. She loved books, quiet corners, and the smell of old paper. She balanced Robert's toughness with kindness. Their home was not a mansion, but it was warm. 2 stories, white siding, green lawn. Neighbors always waved when Robert mowed the grass or when Linda baked pies for block parties. David was an only child. His father often looked him in the eye and said, "Someday, all this will be yours, son. Take care of it. Take care of our name." David always nodded with pride. His father's words were heavy, but they felt like armor. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, the Miller house was full of relatives. The smell of roasted turkey, laughter echoing in the halls, kids running around. And always there were the cousins, Mark and Stephen. Mark was slick, tall, and smooth-talking. He had a way of making everyone laugh, but his eyes were always calculating. He wore fancy clothes even as a teenager, always boasting about money, cars, and the life he wanted. Stephen, his younger brother, was different, quiet. He followed Mark like a shadow, nodding to whatever Mark said. David treated them like brothers. They played basketball in the driveway, shared jokes, and even fought sometimes. But to David, they were family. He never noticed the envy in their eyes when his father clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You'll run the business one day." When David turned 25, life looked good. He worked alongside his father in the company. He handled clients, learned contracts, walked construction sites with pride. At night, he'd sit with his mom in the kitchen, sipping coffee, laughing about old memories. It was normal. It was safe. It was family. But storms don't announce themselves. They creep in, quiet and cold. It started when Robert fell sick. A cough at first, then chest pain, then hospital visits. The diagnosis hit like a hammer. cancer. David sat in the hospital room, fists pressed against his knees, eyes red. His father lay in the bed, pale but still fierce. "Don't cry for me, son," Robert whispered. "Just promise me. Don't let anyone take what's ours." David's throat tightened. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He nodded hard. "I promise, Dad." But the promise would be tested sooner than he imagined. David's decline was fast. Within months, he was gone. The day of the funeral was cold. The Boston sky hung heavy with gray clouds. David stood in a black suit, his face pale, his shoulders hunched. His mother leaned on him, trembling, clutching at tissue. Relatives filled the church, hushed whispers, sorrowful faces. Mark approached, placing a hand on David's back. "You're strong, cousin," he said softly. But his smile was small, too small. Stephen gave a quick hug, his eyes darting away, avoiding David's gaze. David didn't notice. His world was shattered. He clenched his fists as the coffin lowered into the ground. His jaw locked, his chest heaved with silent sobs. After the funeral, David worked harder than ever. He wanted to honor his father. He wanted to protect his mother. The construction company still had clients. The properties still brought rent. It was tough, but possible. Linda often touched his arm, smiling weakly. "Your father would be proud." Those words kept him going. But then questions began to rise. David's uncle, Mark and Stephen's father, started visiting often. He'd say things like, "Do you have all the paperwork? Your dad left things messy." Or, "Maybe Mark can help. He's good with numbers." David, still grieving, too trusting, said yes. Mark stepped in with a confident smile. "Don't worry, cousin. I'll take care of it. We're family." David nodded, relieved, grateful. But little things felt off. A folder missing from Robert's old office, letters from the bank arriving later than usual, Mark asking Linda to sign routine documents, reassuring her with a smooth voice. When David questioned it, Mark laughed. "Relax, cousin. You're just stressed. Trust me." David forced a smile, though unease stirred inside. His mother, tired and frail, leaned on Mark's promises. She believed family would never hurt family. David wanted to believe it too. But at family dinners, David started noticing Mark's smirks, Stephen's nervous glances, his uncle's sly comments about business matters. David's fists would clench under the table, his jaw would lock, but he stayed silent. He told himself, "They're just helping. They wouldn't hurt me, not them." But deep in his gut, a voice whispered, "Be careful. Something is wrong." And soon, that voice would be proven right.
The betrayal. It happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the window of David's apartment. His mother was lying down, tired from another restless night. David's phone buzzed. He picked it up, pressing it to his ear. "Hello?" A calm voice spoke. "Mr. Miller, this is the county clerk's office. We're calling to confirm the property transfer that was finalized last week." David's brows furrowed. His chest tightened. "What transfer?" The line went silent for a second. Then the voice replied, "The Miller estate. All properties under Robert Miller. Ownership has been transferred to Mark Miller. Signed and sealed." David froze. His grip on the phone slipped. His heart pounded in his chest. Thump, thump, thump. "No, no, that's wrong! That's impossible!" He slammed his fist against the table. His jaw locked. His breath came sharp and shallow. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and keys and rushed out into the rain. David burst into the county building. Water dripped from his hair and jacket. His fists were clenched tight. "I need to see the Miller estate files," he demanded, voice sharp, almost breaking. The clerk, startled, handed him a thick folder. David's trembling hands opened it. His eyes scanned the papers. His father's signature, his mother's, even his own name. But all of them forged. The ink looked real. The stamps were official. But David knew. He knew every curve of his father's handwriting, and this was not it. His throat tightened. His knees weakened. His vision blurred. No, that's wrong. That's impossible. He slammed his fist against the table. His jaw locked. His breath came sharp and shallow. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and keys and rushed out into the rain. David burst into the county building. Water dripped from his hair and jacket. His fists were clenched tight. "You forged everything! You stole my father's life's work!" he shouted. His voice echoed off the walls. Mark chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Relax, cousin. It's just business." David stepped forward, his jaw clenched, his teeth grinding. "That was my father's sweat, his blood, and you—" Mark cut him off, smirk curling wider. "Because you're weak. Weak men don't deserve power. You never had the guts to run this business. I do." Stephen leaned back, his smirk growing. His arms folded across his chest like a guard dog. David's nails dug into his palms until tiny drops of blood appeared. His shoulders shook. His voice trembled with rage. "You'll pay for this! I swear you will!" Mark leaned closer, his face inches from David's. His eyes glistened like a snake ready to strike. "Get in line, cousin." David's whole body tensed. His fists rose halfway. His breath came heavy. But he stopped himself. Not now. Not like this. He turned and stormed out, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with tears. Outside, rain poured down. David punched the brick wall with all his strength. Crack! Pain shot through his knuckles. Blood smeared the wall. But he didn't care. He pressed his forehead against the cold, wet brick. His chest heaved. His voice cracked into the storm. "You'll pay. I'll make you pay." The next few days were torture. Mark and Stephen moved fast. They changed locks on properties. They sent eviction notices to tenants. They even had the nerve to send a legal notice to David and his mother, ordering them to vacate their own home. Linda sat on the couch, the letter shaking in her hands. Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. How could they do this? Their family! David knelt before her, grabbing her trembling hands. His own eyes were wet, but his jaw was stiff. "They're not family anymore, Mom. Not after this." She sobbed quietly, clutching his hands like a lifeline. David's chest ached. His fists tightened again. His teeth ground until his jaw hurt. Everywhere he went, he saw Mark's smirk in his mind. That poisonous grin, that smug voice, that betrayal. And each time, David's rage grew sharper, stronger, hotter, until the fire inside him burned brighter than the despair. By the end of that week, David had lost nearly everything. His home, his father's company, his family's name, all because of his cousins. But in the ashes of that betrayal, something darker began to rise. David stood in his empty apartment, fists clenched, eyes hard as steel. His voice was low, sharp, filled with fury. "They think I'm broken. They think they've won. But this is only the beginning. A heavy breath escaped his chest as he stared into the cracked mirror on the wall. His reflection stared back, not broken anymore, but burning.
The eviction notice came quicker than David expected. A sheriff's deputy knocked on the door of the Miller family house. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." David's mother, Linda, clutched her chest, her face pale. "This is our home," she whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. "I raised my son here. My husband built this with his hands." David stood in the doorway, fists clenched, jaw locked. His eyes burned as he glared at the deputy, but he knew it was pointless. The law was already on Mark's side. 3 days later, David and Linda carried their belongings into cardboard boxes. David's arms trembled as he lifted the heavy frames of family photos. His jaw tightened when he saw his father's smiling face inside the glass. He whispered under his breath, "I won't let them erase you, Dad." Linda held a smaller box, her frail hands shaking. Inside was Robert's old toolbox, rusted but precious. She pressed it against her chest, sobbing quietly. "How could family do this to us, David? How could they?" David wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. His own tears stung, but his face hardened. He said sharply, "They're not family anymore." They moved into a cramped apartment on the rough edge of Boston. The walls were cracked. The air smelled of dampness. The neighbors argued loudly in the hallway. Linda sat on a thin couch, holding her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent cries. David worked 2 jobs to cover rent and food. By day, he did construction work. By night, he worked as a security guard at a factory. His body ached. His hands blistered. His eyes grew hollow with exhaustion. He would return home at dawn, drop onto the couch, and stare at the ceiling. His fists clenched, his jaw locked. Every night, the same thoughts echoed in his mind. Mark's grin, Stephen's smirk, their laughter, their betrayal. One Saturday, David passed by a high-end restaurant downtown. Through the glass windows, he saw them. Mark and Stephen, dressed in expensive suits, laughing loudly with their friends, champagne glasses in hand. Stephen leaned back in his chair, smirking. Mark raised his glass high, shouting, "To new beginnings!" David froze on the sidewalk, rain dripping down his hair. His fists clenched at his sides. His teeth ground until he thought they'd break. His chest heaved with sharp breaths. People walked around him, but he didn't move. His whole body trembled with rage. Inside, Mark noticed him through the glass. Their eyes locked. Mark smirked, raising his glass mockingly in David's direction. David's stomach twisted. His vision blurred with hot tears. His lips curled as he whispered to himself, "One day, you will regret this." He turned and walked into the rain, fists still clenched, jaw still locked. David tried to fight back legally. He visited lawyers. He laid out his father's letters, signatures, and business records. He pointed out differences in handwriting. Each lawyer shook his head. "The documents filed are official. Unless you can prove forgery beyond doubt, it's over." David's shoulders slumped. His eyes dropped to the floor. His voice cracked. "But
They faked everything. How can you not see it? One lawyer sighed. I'm sorry, son. The law doesn't care what you feel. It only cares what you can prove. David left the office with his fists jammed deep into his pockets. His teeth ground until he thought they'd break. Outside, the cold wind slapped his face. His chest heaved with frustration. He whispered through clenched teeth, "They think I'm powerless. They think they've won." One night, David came home from his security shift. His body was sore, his eyes bloodshot. He found his mother sitting on the floor. The lights were dim. A family photo lay in her lap. Her hair was messy, her cheeks streaked with tears. She looked up at him with broken eyes. "Your father worked so hard, David, and now it's like he never existed." David's chest ached. His throat tightened. He dropped to his knees beside her, wrapping her in his arms. His eyes filled with tears, his voice shook. "I'll fix this, Mom. I swear I will." She clung to him, trembling. "I don't care about the money," she whispered. "I just wanted family. I just wanted peace." David closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against hers. His jaw locked, his fists clenched even as he held her. Inside, rage burned hotter than ever. Meanwhile, Mark and Stephen rose higher. Mark bought a luxury car, a black Mercedes that gleamed under city lights. He posted photos online, captioned, "Hard work pays off." Stephen bragged at bars, telling anyone who'd listen about the business empire they were building. At night, their mansion lit up with parties. Music thumped, laughter echoed, bottles popped. David watched from the shadows once. He stood across the street, fists clenched, jaw tight, eyes burning with fire. Through the windows, he saw them dancing, smiling, living off his father's blood. His chest rose and fell with sharp, heavy breaths. He whispered to himself, "Enjoy it while you can, because this won't last." Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. David's body grew leaner from work, his eyes harder, his shoulders straighter. The pain never faded, but it began to forge something inside him. He was no longer just a grieving son, no longer just a victim. He was becoming something else, someone else, and deep in his chest, the fire of revenge burnt brighter with every breath.
Winter came to Boston. Snow covered the streets, muffling the city's noise. David sat at the small kitchen table in their cramped apartment. His mother slept in the next room, exhausted from crying. The table was covered with papers, old letters, bank records, his father's business contracts. David's eyes scanned every line, his brows furrowed, his jaw locked tight. He whispered, his voice sharp and low. There has to be something, some mistake, some proof. David's jobs had already built his strength. Construction by day, security by night. His arms were thick, his back strong, his hands calloused. But now he wanted more. Every morning before work, he ran through the icy streets. His breath came out in clouds, sharp and heavy. His feet pounded the pavement, snow crunching beneath his shoes. He joined a local gym. The weights clanged as he lifted. His arms shook, sweat dripping down his forehead. His jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed at the mirror. Stronger. I have to be stronger. Other men at the gym noticed his intensity. He barely spoke. He just pushed himself harder each day. But strength alone wasn't enough. Late at night, after his security shift, David sat at the table again. His eyes scanned legal books he borrowed from the library. He scribbled notes in a worn notebook. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. His shoulders slumped, but his face stayed firm. "Law failed me once," he muttered, his fist pounding the table softly. "But next time, I'll be ready." He practiced signatures. He compared handwriting samples. He traced differences with a pencil, circling loops, slants, and spaces. His mind sharpened. He began to see patterns. David needed more than knowledge. He needed evidence. He started following Mark and Stephen from a distance. He stood across the street as they left the office. He leaned against lampposts, watching them climb into their cars. His eyes tracked their movements, memorizing routes. One night, he tailed Stephen to a bar. Stephen stumbled out drunk, laughing with friends. His tie hung loose, his cheeks red. David's fists tightened at the sight, but he stayed calm. He pulled out a small notebook and jotted down details. "Every weakness. I'll find them all." One evening at the gym, David met a man named Carlos. Carlos was older, mid-40s, with tattoos covering his arms. He noticed David's intensity on the punching bag, fists slamming, sweat flying, grunts sharp. Thup, thup, bam! Carlos raised an eyebrow. "You're not here just to get fit, are you?" David paused, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. His eyes narrowed. He didn't answer. Carlos smirked darkly. "Justice, huh? Sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms." From that day, Carlos trained him in street fighting. He taught David how to strike fast, how to use surroundings, how to stay on his feet even when outnumbered. David's fists grew sharper, his stance firmer, his eyes colder. One night, while going through his father's old letters again, David found something. It was a letter Robert had written, but never sent. In it, Robert mentioned a hidden safe deposit box at a local bank. David's eyes widened, his heart pounded. If this is real. He rushed to the bank the next morning. With ID and proof, he convinced the clerk to let him in. Inside the box, he found what he had been searching for. Original documents, signed contracts, letters with Robert's authentic signature. His hands shook as he pulled them out. His lips curled into the first real smile in months. His eyes gleamed with fire. This is it. This is the weapon. David didn't strike right away. He needed to test them. At another bar, Stephen bragged loudly about his victories. David sat at the far end, a hood pulled low. He watched, listened. Stephen's loose tongue spilled more than he realized. "We pulled it off, man," Stephen laughed to his friends. "Mark's a genius with paperwork. The idiot cousin never saw it coming." David's fist tightened around his glass. His jaw locked. His chest heaved. But he didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he pulled out his phone, pressed record. Stephen's voice echoed into the microphone. "We forged half those papers. If anyone ever digs deep enough, we're screwed." David's lips curled into a sharp smile. His eyes burned with cold fire. "Got you," he whispered. Weeks turned into months. David's body grew leaner, stronger, sharper, his mind clearer, his evidence pile thicker. He no longer looked like the broken man who had been evicted from his home. His eyes now were hard, determined. His jaw was sharp, always clenched with focus. His posture straight, shoulders squared. Linda noticed the change. One night she touched his arm gently. Her voice trembled. "You scare me sometimes, David. You're not the same boy." David looked at her, his eyes softer for just a moment. He squeezed her hand. "I have to change, Mom. It's the only way to beat them." She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. David gathered everything: the safe deposit box documents, the recorded confession from Stephen, photos of their lavish lifestyle bought with stolen wealth. He placed them neatly in a black folder. He tapped it with his finger, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This is the truth. This is my father's honor." But he knew one thing: evidence wasn't enough. Mark and Stephen were too slick, too connected. He would need more. He would need to bring them down not just with papers, but with force. His fists clenched, his jaw locked, his eyes burned. "It's time," he whispered. David was no longer the grieving son, no longer the victim. He was the storm.
Heavy, sharp, voice cracked slightly when reading betrayal moments. It was late at night when David made his move. The snow had melted into dirty slush on the Boston streets. A cold wind cut through the air, sharp and biting. David stood across the street from the mansion that once belonged to his father. His hood was up, his fists clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with fire. Through the windows, music thumped. Laughter spilled out into the night. Another one of Mark and Stephen's parties. David's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. His teeth ground together. Tonight, it ends. David pushed through the front gates. He didn't sneak. He didn't hide. His boots crunched on the gravel path, steady and loud. Inside, Stephen was pouring champagne into a glass when he noticed movement outside. He squinted. The front doors burst open. Bam! Gasps filled the room. Music stopped. There stood David. His shoulders were broad, his stance solid, his fists tight. His eyes locked on Mark and Stephen like a predator on prey. Mark smirked, lifting his glass lazily. "Well, well, look who crawled back." Stephen chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Did you come to beg, cousin? Huh? Want some pocket change?" David didn't speak. His jaw clenched, his fists flexed. He stepped closer. Mark's smirk widened. "Security! Get this!" Before he could finish, David lunged. His fist slammed into Mark's jaw. Crack! Mark stumbled backward, his glass shattering across the floor. Gasps and screams echoed through the room. Stephen's eyes widened. His smirk vanished. "You crazy bastard!" David turned sharply, his teeth clenched, his eyes blazing. "Crazy? No. I'm the storm you created." Stephen rushed forward, swinging wildly. David ducked, his muscles coiled, and drove his fist into Stephen's gut. Thud. Stephen doubled over, gasping for air, spit flying from his lips. David grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. His eyes were inches from Stephen's, his teeth bared, his voice was sharp, low, and filled with fury. "You stole my father's blood. Now you pay with your own." He slammed Stephen to the floor. Bam! Guests screamed, some running for the door. Others stood frozen, eyes wide with shock. Mark staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his lip, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed a wine bottle from the table and smashed it on the counter. The jagged glass gleamed in his hand. "You want to fight, cousin? Let's fight." Mark swung the broken bottle. Swoosh. David dodged, his jaw tight, sweat dripping down his temple. He slammed his elbow into Mark's ribs. Crack! Mark grunted, stumbling. Stephen, still on the ground, pulled himself up and lunged at David from behind.
He wrapped his arms around David's neck, choking him. His face turned red, veins bulging in his forehead. His teeth clenched as he gasped, tightened. Mark staggered forward with the bottle raised high. At the last second, David slammed his head backward, thud. His skull cracked into Stephen's nose. Blood gushed. Stephen screamed, clutching his face. David ripped free, spinning toward Mark. The bottle came down. Crash. David caught Mark's wrist, twisting hard. The bottle clattered to the floor. David's fist shot forward, smashing into Mark's nose. Crack. Blood sprayed. Mark fell back against the table, flipping it over. Plates and glasses shattered. David straddled Mark, fist slamming down again and again. Bam, bam, bam. His knuckles split, blood dripping, but he didn't stop. Mark's face turned red, swollen, blood pouring from his mouth. His hands flailed weakly. "Stop!" Stephen shouted, his voice broken. David turned, his face covered in sweat and blood, his eyes wild, teeth clenched. Stephen froze, his back pressed to the wall, fear flooding his eyes. David stood slowly, his chest heaving. He grabbed Stephen by the shirt, dragging him forward. His voice was sharp, deadly. "You thought I was weak. You thought I was nothing. Look at me now." Stephen's lips trembled, blood dripping from his nose. His voice cracked. "Please, please don't." David's fist slammed into his stomach. Thud. Stephen coughed, collapsing to his knees. David leaned close, his voice low, sharp as a knife. "You forged my father's name. You erased his life. But tonight," his fist tightened, "I erase you." Stephen tried to crawl away, his hands trembling. Mark groaned on the floor, barely conscious. David stood up tall, his fists dripping with blood, his face hard, unflinching. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. For a moment, silence filled the room. Only the sound of heavy breathing, broken glass, and dripping blood remained. Then David stepped forward, his fist shot down one last time. Crack. Stephen collapsed, his body limp. Mark groaned on the floor, barely conscious. David stood tall, his fists dripping with blood, his face hard, unflinching. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He looked down at them, the cousins who had stolen everything. Now beaten, broken, their smirk grins gone forever. David's lips curled into the smallest, coldest smile. His jaw unclenched. "It's over," he whispered. The guests were gone. The mansion was a wreck. David stood alone, surrounded by shattered glass, overturned tables and blood. His fist trembled, his knuckles raw and split. He closed his eyes, his chest heaving. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Stand tall, son. Never let them break you." David opened his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek, but his expression was strong, firm. Justice had been served, not by law, but by his own hands.
The mansion was silent. The chandeliers above swayed slightly, their light reflecting off broken glass. Tables were overturned, champagne spilled across the floor, blood dripping into the cracks between the tiles. Mark groaned weakly on the ground, his face swollen and bloody. Stephen lay unconscious, chest rising and falling shallowly. David stood in the center of the chaos, his fists raw, his shirt stained with blood and sweat. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. For a long moment, he just stood there, eyes burning, fists trembling. Then, slowly, he unclenched his hands. His jaw relaxed. It was over. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed against the mansion windows. Tires screeched outside. Police officers stormed the front doors, guns drawn. "Freeze!" one shouted. David didn't move. His arms hung at his sides. His eyes stared straight ahead, calm for the first time in months. Two officers rushed past him to check on Mark and Stephen. Others circled around, pointing guns at David. "Hands up!" David raised his hands slowly. His knuckles were split open, blood dripping down his wrists. An officer cuffed him, pulling his arms behind his back. The cold metal bit into his skin. As they led him outside, David kept his eyes forward, his face firm, jaw set. At the station, David handed over the black folder he had prepared. The safe deposit documents, the recordings, the forged papers. His voice was calm, steady. "They forged everything. They stole my father's legacy. You'll find the proof in there." The detectives looked through the papers, their brows furrowed. They exchanged glances. Hours later, a senior officer walked in, holding the folder tightly. He stared at David, then sighed. "Son, looks like you've been telling the truth. These cousins of yours are going down hard." David leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy but steady. A faint smile touched his lips. News spread quickly. Headlines screamed across Boston papers and online feeds. Wealthy heirs exposed in massive fraud scandal. Forgery, fraud, and family betrayal. The Miller cousins fall. Mark and Stephen were charged with multiple counts of forgery, fraud, and theft. Photos showed them in handcuffs, their faces bruised and swollen, their expensive suits stained. Once proud businessmen, now disgraced criminals. The same city that once cheered their success now spat on their names. Of course, David had to face his own trial. The courtroom was tense. David sat at the defense table, his mother in the audience, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. The prosecutor painted him as violent, reckless. The cousins' lawyers pushed for the harshest sentence. But then David's lawyer stood and presented the evidence, the forgeries, the recordings, the fraud. The judge listened carefully. The jury watched. At one point, Stephen's recorded voice echoed in the courtroom. "We forged half those papers. If anyone ever digs deep enough, we're screwed." Gasps filled the room. David sat still, his face calm, but his fists tightened slightly under the table. His jaw locked as he watched Mark and Stephen squirm in their seats. When it was time for the verdict, the jury ruled. David guilty of assault, but Mark and Stephen guilty of major financial fraud. The judge looked at David carefully. "You acted outside the law, Mr. Miller, but given the circumstances and the overwhelming fraud committed against you, your sentence will be reduced." David exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing. Mark and Stephen were sentenced to long prison terms. Their assets were seized, their reputation destroyed. Reporters shouted as they were dragged away in orange jumpsuits. Cameras flashed. Their heads hung low, no smug smiles left. David's mother watched the news at home. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. She whispered, "Robert, they finally paid." David served a short sentence for the violence, but when he got out, the city felt different. The weight on his chest had lifted. He stepped outside the prison gates. His mother waited there, her arms open. David hugged her tightly, his eyes closed, his jaw unclenched, his fists finally relaxed. For the first time in years, he felt free. One evening, David stood in front of the old Miller estate. The mansion was empty now, windows dark, gates locked. He placed his hand on the cold iron fence, staring at the house his father had built. His reflection showed in the glass. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but his eyes were steady. His jaw was no longer tight, his fists no longer clenched. He whispered, "Dad, I kept my promise. They'll never erase you again." David and his mother moved into a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the mansion, it wasn't the wealth, but it was peace. At night, David sat on the porch, staring at the stars. His hands were scarred, his knuckles rough, but his heart was lighter. His lips curved into a soft smile. He had lost everything, but he had also won the one thing that mattered most: justice. Sometimes the law fails, sometimes family betrays, but when a man carries the fire of truth in his chest, no lie can bury it forever. Justice doesn't always come in courts. Sometimes it comes in blood, sweat, and broken fists. And sometimes that's the only way.